I want to welcome everyone today to one of our John Landrum Bryant lecture series presentations. This series is part of the Arts and Education Program core course, and many of you are members of the program and the core course. But all of us who are here on a regular basis in the core course are very delighted to have those of you who have joined us for today's lecture. I assume that you are here because you are lovers of the arts, or lovers of education, or lovers of Dick Deasy's work, or all of the above. Or you're curious about these things and thought that this was a good way to learn more, and I think it is. So welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dick Deasy. I first met Dick in the period leading up to the publication of Champions of Change, a volume I know many of you are familiar with. And I've come to know him and his work through the process of, or I began to know him and his work through the process of getting that volume published. Getting to know Dick and the work of the Arts Education Partnership has been one of the pleasures of the last decade for me. I believe that Dick and AEP, under his guidance and leadership, have made an extremely valuable contribution to the arts and education in this country. Together, Dick and his colleagues have urged all of us to advance this field through exemplary practice, excellent research, progressive policy, and continual efforts to break down barriers between arts educators and the rest of the education community. If I were to put it in a phrase, Dick's gotten more of us talking to more other people that we hadn't been talking to than probably anyone else in this field in the last decade. The volumes and the publications that have come out of the Arts Education Partnership, and they bear Dick's signature, if not always his authorship, certainly always as wise counsel and guide. These volumes are a kind of catalog of the most important publications in the arts and education of the last decade, with the exception, of course, of Jessica Davis's new publication. Yes. Gaining the Arts Advantage, Lessons from School Districts That Value the Arts. Gaining the Arts Advantage 2, More Lessons. Champions of Change, Learning Partnerships, Critical Links, Learning in the Arts and Student Academic and Social Development, and 2 reports on new directions for arts education research. This is just the beginning. This is only partial list here that I'm giving, and I'm sure that many, if not all of you, are familiar with most of these documents. For all of this, we thank Dick and his many colleagues at AEP and the many people that he's brought in to work together to produce this work. I want to give very, very short, I'm going to give a one-sentence biography of Dick. In 1994, after living many other lives, Dick became the first and only director of the Arts Education Partnership. The rest of his story I will leave to him. When Dick and I first began to talk about what his comments today would focus on, I was asking him if he would be willing to really bring us into the findings of a study that he and his colleagues and many others have been working on in recent years on the role of the arts in high-poverty schools in the United States. And he was open to that. But as we continued the conversation, and it became clear to me that the Arts Education Partnership is, in October, will celebrate its 10th birthday. And that means that Dick and his colleagues have been at this business of creating this organization for that much time. Clearly, the accomplishments are tremendous. But the question that was on my mind that I put to Dick was, what are the lessons from the inside? What got you into this adventure? What has it meant? What have the surprises been? And what have the lessons been? I think that this is this is a narrative, a story of practice, research, policy, the intersections of all of these realms of work, and adventure, struggle, dragons, dungeons, I don't know.
St. George to the rescue.
Dick took up the idea to use this both as a moment to share a little bit about this new study, which he's currently working with others to write up, but also to really reflect on this important period in his life and important period in the field of arts and education. So with that, I turn it over to Dick with pleasure.
I'm not going to do any of that. Actually, what Steve said to me somewhat more succinctly when he was talking about this opportunity was, can you explain why you did the things you did during the 10 years of leading the Arts Education Partnership? And he said, why don't you step back from the 10 years and think about that and answer the question why? Well, I decided to step way back. And what I'm going to do are a few things. But I want to first say, as I always do, it's a privilege to be here and an honor to be back. And it's a great honor that Jessica, who invited me for 2 successive years to do this, is here to listen to it again. I mean, that is that's an extraordinary testimony to something. I hope it's not you just didn't have anything else to do today. It's great to be back. Here's what I'd like to do. The partnership was founded 10 years ago. I'd like to place you in the context of what was going on in education at that moment in time and why the partnership was created. I want to do that briefly. And then I want to point out what was the challenge of creating the partnership, which at the time involved 140 national organizations and still does, and now has involved organizations across the country in a multiplicity of ways. But what was the challenge when I walked in the door? And then I'm going to step back and talk a little bit, well, who was the guy that walked in the door? On the assumption that it's the interface between who you are and what you bring to the set of conditions that you face, it's that relationship that gives rise to the decisions you make about how to go forward and how to adjust in the process. So if that's okay, I'll show you just as rapidly as I can the condition that existed in education at the time. It's only 10 years ago, but so much moves so fast often. Then where we were, then who was I, and then I'll come to this, what did we then do, myself arising out of my own perspectives and views, but then the work that we created and why that work at that point in time. So if I push this right, yeah. Here was the context in 1994. For many of you, this is quite familiar. For some of you, it might be when you were still in high school, for all I know. In 1994 was the Goals 2000 Educate America Act, which was the revision of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That was the revision before the one we have now that's now called No Child Left Behind. It's the same basic act, but it gets revised and reauthorized periodically. Were you familiar with that? Among the things that was, the standards movement, the so-called standards movement had taken hold in the late 80s into the early 90s. President Bush, the first Bush, convened a group of folks, heads of education around the country, to generate the beginning of that. It was actually passed in the Clinton administration as Goals 2000. And among other things, it required the creation of all the standards we now know so much about, including the standards in the arts. That law required every state to create a comprehensive plan for improving its schools. It was a plan-based activity, and they were called strategic plans. And the arts were in the law as a core subject. That was the first time ever. You'll hear people now talk about No Child Left Behind, saying No Child Left Behind is the first time the arts were in the core, but that's not the case. It was in Goals 2000. It's just a little more robustly present in the current law. So here was a set of conditions, a new federal law that was requiring comprehensive state plans based on standards and expectations, and the arts were going to be part of that. So some of the spin-offs from that immediately were that all the arts associations got together and wrote the National Voluntary Standards for Arts Education, the 4 disciplines. I assume you've sort of gotten acquainted with those documents. That was a monumental achievement in my judgment on a political level. It got the 4 disciplines, the visual and performing arts, visual music, dance, theater, to come together and create a single document. An amazing feat, which I'll come back to in a second. And even more interesting to me, they got together and created the framework for what would be assessed in the National Assessment of Arts Education, which took place in 1997. And that's the document that framed the arts as processes of responding, performing, and creating. Monumental. These are the contextual things for the arts and education at the time, movements afoot. The Secretary of Education at that time was Richard Riley, who had been the governor of South Carolina, came in. This is now as the Clinton administration gets underway. And over at the National Endowment for the Arts was Jane Alexander, now back on Broadway, as you know. And the two of them got their heads together, and with the help of their senior aides, who happened to be married, Jane's deputy at the endowment was Scott Shanklin Peterson, and her husband, Terry Peterson, was senior counselor to Dick Riley. So we had a lovely partnership here, and they spawned the idea that wouldn't it be great to create a possibility of the arts world seizing the advantage of that law. And here is what they decided to do, and here was the challenge that I ended up with. They convened over about a year period in 1994, 140 organizations across the span, government agencies, arts groups, education groups, civil rights groups, anybody that they thought had an interest and concern about advancing arts in the context of school change and school improvement. And that group produced this document. Anybody ever seen that one? That was the blueprint for what should happen to make this advance. And it's about 25, 30 pages. Basically, it said, let's take advantage of this law, folks. We can seize the opportunity and pass a law. The law is passing, and it creates these state plans, and the arts are mentioned. Go for it, gang. And here was a proposed strategy. Let's create a partnership at the national level of all the interested parties. Let's do that at the state. Let's do it locally. And let's move this thing forward. Everybody sort of cut their wrists and rubbed the blood together and said, we're in favor of this, and then they all went home. Interestingly, Dick Riley and Jane Alexander said, oh, no, we'll pay for this. We will pay to create an administrative entity that will bring you folks together to do this plan. And they did, and I got hired to do it. And so the challenge was to do it, and nobody knew who I was, because I wasn't at any of these meetings. And I remember when the 4 of them, Dick and Jane, and the heads of the 50 state departments of education and the 50 state arts agencies, that's the 4 people, when they hired me, they finally said, well, how will you establish any credibility? And I said, I don't have a clue. So let me then talk about who was the guy that walked in the door to do this. And I'm going to give you some autobiographical notes. And this was the part of this that was so interesting to me, as I said to Steve just a little bit earlier. I kind of figured out, here's who I've been. My whole life has been spent exploring that question. What are human beings and their creations? And those creations fell for me into those 3 categories. By arts, I mean the whole panoply of arts, anything well made according to the canons of applicability. I meant everything, not just the fine and performing arts, arts construed as those things that we humans make that measure up to some standard of quality. Community, to me, and I'll come to that quickly, not groups, but communities. That is where there's a commitment to one another, respect, and the capacity to live humanly and inclusively among that whole concept of community, and I'll tell you why. And finally, how do institutions and systems, a human creation, how do they come, how do they function, and how do they work? I've been exploring these for years across these areas. And here's what, that's a mistake. Reconciling opposite is what I meant to put up there, which is the title of this talk. Because within each of those, there is the possibility for sets of tensions to develop and I give you a little bit, between structure and purpose, content and form, individual and group. There's a set of paradoxical dynamics at work in all of those areas, and they can either be creative or they can be very deadening. So laws can be creative or they can be deadening. The formal requirements of a dance can be enlivening or it can be deadening. There has always been in my mind this curiosity about how do these things, the metaphor I began to use years and years ago, I'm really old. I started teaching 40 years ago. The metaphor always in my mind was the human body, the skeleton and the really living creature. You can't have one without the other, but if you only have a skeleton, you're dead. And that metaphor is what I've always been sort of playing with in all of my work. And I had careers in these four areas. The first one is not very well known to people, but it's really quite formative, and I wanted to deal with it a little bit. Most of my biography deals with the ones that are more publicly visible, namely journalism, education, international exchange. If you've ever read my bio, I've sort of wandered from. But I grew up as a Catholic kid in Pittsburgh, from a blue-collar family, and what changed my life was singing in a choir. And that experience of and as you probably know, in the Catholic Church, the great music is the music of largely Europe. And we sang in all the languages, and we were good. We were very good. We performed around the city, and I was the alto lead. And that experience of the choir as the community and the music as a dimension of making that community was powerfully important to me. And that was occurring in a beautiful building. Pittsburgh, if you're familiar with Pittsburgh, you know the University of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is filled with neo-Gothic buildings, and the little parish church where I lived had one of the most beautiful churches in the country, actually. And the architecture of that building and architecture in general has become extremely formative in my life. And the rituals, which were aesthetic, the aesthetic of the rituals of that particular church were powerful to me. The visual way in which ritual was carried out. I, by the way, hold that when religion moves away from those aesthetic considerations is when it's gone astray. And the writing, the texts that were so crucial. But it was interesting to me because this was in the context of a very institutional hierarchical church, which as a boy and until later on, it never really dawned on me because it was only where I lived that I cared about. I didn't have a notion that there was a universal hope and all that. It wasn't really important. It was this church. But as I grew older, and I'll skip forward because this actually stays with me for quite some time. I go to high school, in a Catholic high school. I'm taught by a group called the Christian Brothers. I joined that order for a period of time. I teach in a private preparatory school. And then things begin to happen. It's the late 60s, and life is changing. So I go to Princeton to get a doctorate. And I go there to get it in philosophy of religion. But I ended up studying philosophy for the most part. But I end up singing in the chapel choir. And I'm back in a beautiful neo-Gothic building on the campus of Princeton in the choir. And I found Princeton a very daunting place. Huge, sprawling. Maybe some of you have that experience coming here. And I was in a highly precious program, philosophy. There were only 8 students. And the communal dimension of it was the dimension of this choir singing great music in this beautiful physical space. And throughout that, I keep pondering this. In this case, the institution was the university. And you could get very lost in that place. And I was lost because I didn't know a soul when I went there. And the mediating entity to me, again, became this choir in beautiful physical space. And I began to feel more at home in that context as mediated through the arts. And I continue to come back, and I'm skipping 25 years with what I just said. I continue to come back in my mind to this experience of the art, the visual work, the architectural work, the music. By that time, I was also studying visual arts. These things were what made it possible for me to live in these settings and to sort of bend the institution to my desires and what I wanted to be. And the choir, in both cases, became the community within which I could find colleagues and enjoy mutual respect and affection while I dealt with the bigger reality. All right, well, that's I'm going to try and do this quickly. Okay, well, then I don't like doing academic philosophy. I just didn't like doing it. And it was the 60s, and, you know, it was Vietnam War. We were marching in the streets. Life was on the streets. So I said, I'm leaving. And I left. I didn't finish the doctorate. And I went and drove a truck for a period of time. And so I'm driving this truck, and I said, there are better ways to do this, to find out how the world really works than to drive a truck. Besides, it was cold, and it was a bread truck, and I was freezing. And I said, why don't I go into something where I can actually find out the way the world works more dynamically and interesting than I returning to my blue-collar roots. So I became a journalist. And I worked in Bucks County, Pennsylvania to begin with, which is, as you know, back in the 30s and 40s, some of you recall, was the New York literati hung out. It's this beautiful sylvan place. But underneath that beautiful sylvan place are some horrible living conditions for poor people. And I began to write about that. And eventually I won a lot of awards for that, and I got hired to cover city government in Philadelphia, and I was a political reporter covering city government, and I also covered the Watergate for some of the Nixon things. Well, what did I learn from that? Suddenly I began to realize how institutions in a society work, these social institutions, how power works, and how the human creations of government and institutions actually can be dangerous. And how do you mediate against the capacity they have to become rigid and problematic? What keeps them being human, being artifacts of the human being, and not that we run around at their behest, that they have to be shaped by us? This is a democracy. And for the first time, actually, this is curious, I'm in my early 30s, I have to deal with public schools. I hadn't had to do that before. And I was shocked. Because it never dawned on me, I didn't know, this is true, I didn't know there were school districts. It had never entered my consciousness that there were school districts. I thought there were schools, because I hadn't worked in that arena. And suddenly I'm dealing, because I began then to cover education, I was assigned to cover education, and I'm writing about education and public schools, and this is a period of time when public schools are starting to be really destroyed. It's the early 70s. The country's in a deep recession. We're running out of money, and there's war about public education, and I had to write about it and cover it. And I began to see what I thought of as a school, as a relatively modestly contained, like where I taught, wasn't that at all. The school was part of a large system, both districts, state systems, and beginning to be federal systems. You remember, it wasn't until 1965 that there was a real federal education law, the one that we talked about a minute ago. So once again, it's this sort of, how do you in fact balance the human creations called institutions, power, systems, when in fact this is about kids. We're supposed to be doing things in schools for kids, and there's this whole panoply of problem. But by this time I knew something about politics. So I was hired away by the Secretary of Education of Pennsylvania, who called me up one day and he said, you've been writing about this stuff, come out here and help me do something. And so I did. And now I'm in Pennsylvania as the executive assistant to the Secretary of Education, responsible for higher education as well as K-12 education. And it's the beginning of what we now call the school reform movement. It's not yet standardized movement. It's still, in my judgment, and I continue to think this, the greatest changes in public education have been civil rights changes. First, the integration. But these begin to be extended, and Title IX, and different possibilities for women in schools arise. 1972 is the passage of the first Special Education Act. Suddenly we're dealing in public education with challenges of those who, at the time, we were called handicapped. So you have special education coming into the schools. You have new desires and demands that we treat women equally. We still are trying to deal with Brown versus the Board of Ed and deal with the civil rights, the integration issues. It's a time of tremendous ferment in education. And there's a great demand for education reform, but there's no highly theorized way of doing it. It's just, let's fix it. My own response to it was to argue for competency-based education. And now I begin to move from my religious roots through intellectual process into the secular realm, where I was very influenced by Jerome Bruner's reading, where Jerome Bruner's writing on competence, because competence is you're able to do things, and the measure of whether you're educated is your capacity to act. And what we should focus on is are you capable of acting? And if you are, you're in great shape. It's not, can you pass a test? It's, do you have the capacity and the equipment to make yourself, and in making yourself as a human being, to then fulfill and play your role in community and institutions where you're capable of shaping them and not the other way around. And it began to dawn on me at this point that the arts were the most powerful argument I could make about that, because the arts are deep and profound expressions of competence, the ability to make and do things. And so I began to push for competency-based education, wrote a lot about it, and failed. It was just too, the system, Pennsylvania had 504 school districts at the time. We had just consolidated them from 2,500 school districts. So the organizational, institutional problems just overwhelmed us. We really couldn't talk about teaching kids. We were dealing with systemic change, new laws, new requirements, new legal procedures. We were just overwhelmed by the institutional demands to deal with the institutional questions. Nobody was terribly interested in my arguments that, well, this is all for kids, and we ought to be thinking about how to create curriculum and expectations were based on their competence. I just couldn't sell the argument. And we lost an election, and we were out of jobs. So I ended up then in Maryland, and I came into Maryland. A friend of mine was a superintendent of schools there. And the climate had changed now. Now we're really getting into this notion that assessment is the way to think about things. We're at the beginning of accountability issues that you are now reading about every day in the paper. And I was in charge of this stuff. I was the assistant superintendent of schools for instruction, curriculum, research, assessment, and I handled all the congressional relations. So, and I was in this setting, and what I'm trying to say is the contexts are the same for me. These are institutional conditions, and I'm in charge of them. And what am I going to do to fulfill my own views that making community is what human beings should be doing primarily, and that the arts are a profound way of self-realization, and they are the heart of any genuine community. And how am I going to push those ideas forward? And my response was to use that mantra. This is true. I began to talk about schools as communities of thoughtful people. And I tried to convene people, and I did. I mean, it worked. We had 1,300 people working in the Department of Education at the time, and so I began this, we must be a modeled community of thoughtful people. It must be of intellectual quality, and it must be humane. We must treat one another right. And I began then to push for the arts and international education. I had this benighted notion, and if you think about it, it goes back to my childhood, where by definition, if you're in the kind of church I mean, it's an internationalist church. And these are, here, let me step over here and say this. I said to Steve when he asked me to do this, Steve, you know the little funny thing, there are lies, big lies, and statistics. You know that? Well, it's not that. There are lies, big lies, statistics, and memory. Memory lies more than anything. So this is what I'm trying to remember. But I finally, in thinking about this, I said, I was always an internationalist through the music. And I really did believe that if we could get American educators to think about American education in the context of what we now call the global society, maybe they would see that there are other ways to treat children and to raise children. And I saw the arts. So I passed all the graduation requirements for the arts. I did all the work that got the arts into education at that time and was pushing hard on that. When, once again, there was an election in Maryland, I wasn't at risk, but the new government coming in to the state, I didn't think I could work with. And so I said, I'm going to move on. This is shorthand. And I took over this organization called it was the National Council for International Visitors. We worked around the world with embassies to bring people from other countries here who were rising in their professions. And it was an educational and cultural program. And here I learned nonprofit management. It was a large, it was 150 organizations, domestic and international. We worked with all the embassies around the world. So here I am back in government, working with government. Now I'm working with the federal government. They funded it, those 3 federal agencies. And I'm working with the White House and Congress, first Reagan and then when Clinton came in. So this is where I am. I've been working with and in government. I've been studying institutions, learning how they work. I've been looking at how does one, in fact, within those contexts, take the arts seriously and powerfully. And I'm hired from that job to this one. All right, so now here I am. I'm about to go back into that context of challenge. Well, what did I think about the arts at that point? And I was not, and this is the thing, I realized that they were profoundly transformative experiences. They had been for me, and for anybody, and by this time I have lots of artist friends, and I've been doing work in the arts. I'd studied painting and drawing while I was a journalist. So I have lots of friends, and I realize that it's transformative of the human being. Secondly, and this guy goes back to this, they are forms and techniques that liberate the imagination. They are skeleton, they involve a skeleton, but it's to make the flesh and the organism alive. And at their best, you use the form to make something that is potent. There were 3 books that I always had in mind, or 3 comments. I'm an undergraduate English major in college, and I studied literary criticism and wrote a lot about it. Remember John Chardy's book, many of you don't, How Does a Poem Mean? That's a very interesting title. How does it mean? Love that title. There's the great graphic artist Ben Shahn wrote a book called The Shape of Content. I love that, The Shape of Content. And then, of course, we all remember Goethe said that architecture is frozen music. And those things in my mind were sort of metaphorical expressions of what I thought. The other thing I knew from having done music, having studied painting and drawing and work, it's very hard work. I don't think there's almost nothing harder than making works of art. And it has enormously powerful effects. I just knew that. And I knew how hard it was. And I knew how much intelligence it took to make it right. And I knew that these were artifacts that stood apart from the maker and had their own aesthetic reality, and that they shaped the past, present, and future in and of themselves. And that part of the art experience is to bump into one of them. The great experience is to make one. But to bump into one, to have to grapple with it, is such a, and that's the kind of thing Maxine Greene writes a lot about in the aesthetic. And I knew that. That's true. But the other thing I knew was that they could really stir up an institution, or they could destroy it. They could, and if you thought in my life across the 60s, when new music came into being, popular music, I was living in Haight-Ashbury when that rock generation started, and you could see how music can shake the place up. Right? Within schools, you could see where, because the arts are so powerfully and potently revelatory about you, and emotional and intellectual, often the artist is a change agent, almost unwillingly sometimes, but always. And I knew that, and I knew because I had been trying to shake up institutions using the arts in various ways. So I knew that it could do it. If you did it well, they could actually invigorate the place. If you didn't do it well, you were out of it, or in fact, the place began to teeter. So that were my views, and so now I'm going to run one of these places. Okay. Now here's what Steve asked me to talk about. So what did I want to do? What should I do? I go to the first meeting, and here's the structure of the partnership. I have 4 bosses. There's 4 Secretary of Education, Chairman of Endowments, 50 State Department of Education, 50 state arts institutes. I report the forum. They hire and fire me. They've done the first really well. But I have a steering committee of 40 organizations that are a cross-section of the hundreds of organizations part of the partnership. And it is a structure. It determines our planning and how we proceed forward. It's sort of the body I have to work with all the time to make sure we're modeling partnering. And so I have every education association is there, the 2 teachers unions, principals, superintendents of schools, school board, all the major arts organizations, the 4 visual and performing arts teaching groups, symphony orchestras and museums. I have 6 or 7 foundations, the 2 federal agencies, several other government agencies. It's a cross-section of anybody that really wants and can move education. But here's what I thought I would do. I had to place the arts within the context of public education. That was my view. And to show, and when I say I mean these are the things I decided the partnership would have to do. We had to show its role in addressing current policy and educational social trends and concerns. It couldn't be about the arts qua arts. I don't want to go there with all this intrinsic instrumental ability, which I don't think is accurate. But I had to show that the arts in and of themselves responded to the great concern, for instance, about kids dropping out. Secondly, we had to be a community where the steering committee would not be governed by elaborate kind of, let's have bylaws and all that kind of, you don't have to pay to be a member of the partnership. I don't want membership dues. I don't want all those institutional structures that come with dues-paying members who then feel they have to be empowered in formal ways, and you suddenly get yourself encrusted in all of that management of the skeleton. I didn't want to do that. And we had to show that we were value added to the music educators, we would be value added to the visual arts, we would be value added to museums, would be value added to school boards, that the collective work that we would do would be value added to everyone, and they would convert its value into their own missions and purposes. And we would not honor in them individually to be honored individually. We would honor them as members of the community. And I'd empower the steering committee and task forces, and we created all kinds of things. And I would say to them, you're in charge. Here's where we want to go. Tell us where to go. So they were two. Then I said, my own experience over 40 years was, you can't change anything by yourself. And you can't change anything even with your own pals. You have to change things by collaboration and partnership. There's really no other way to do it. None of my experiences ever showed you could really make change. You certainly couldn't make institutional change. You couldn't make laws and policy change. You had to do it through partnership. And in my view, partnership, and I believe this, is the change agent for improving education. Partnership and collaboration. And I personally believe that partnership and collaboration in the arts is the only one that's really going to do it. I don't believe business partnerships can do it. I believe it has to be the vitality of the arts with their unassailable assertion that you're important. Then that one that Steve wants me to really focus on, I thought we better build the research base for effective advocacy. All right. They were the principles I was following. Now here's what was going on in research. Do you know that little pamphlet called Eloquent Evidence? Have you ever seen that? Okay. I walk in the door, and there were two things sitting there. The National Endowment for the Arts had done a compendium called Schools, Communities, and the Arts. It was kind of as a loosely put together. It was the first one ever done. And out of it had come a little pamphlet called Eloquent Evidence, which summarized the findings in that compendium. And Elliot Eisner blasted the hell out of it. This little, and I walk in and there's all this Sturm und Drang going on because Elliot's on the warpath against this little eloquent evidence document, and he's marshaling the troops to say that there is no research that is solid, and this little pamphlet is blah, blah, blah. And that was the reality. And he had if you know Elliot's work, he has had enormous influence at that point. Secondly, the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, which is the U.S. president, that guy, has had a commission, and they had just done a report called Coming Up Taller, where they focused their energies on out-of-school, community-based arts programs, particularly where the kids being involved in it were from very poor circumstances. It's actually it still goes on. But I was a little puzzled by how to respond to these because, given what I've said, I thought we better do this. We better deepen the rigor of the research, because if it was so easy to get people thinking there wasn't anything good, maybe there wasn't. But I didn't know. So let's find out, and let's really commit ourselves to rigorous research, finding it, doing it, and publishing it. Secondly, as a systems guy, because at this point I've been running 2 state departments of education, and I've been focusing on school districts. And I said, you know, the President's Committee is about to go and act like what goes on for kids out of school is more crucial than what goes on for them in school. I said, well, that may be true, but there are 50 million of them in schools. And I wanted then to do something that looked at school districts. There are 16,000 school districts in the United States, 50 million children. And I said, you can't just focus on the out of school. The whole system has to be looked at. So I decided, and got the funding to study. We started with 300 school districts that had quality arts education to find out how do they do that. And the third thing we decided to do was keep abreast of what's going on in public policy and social trends. And early on, we're talking in 1995, 10 years ago, early childhood, Mrs. Clinton, remember, was very interested in early childhood education. Rob Reiner started that, you know, the actor, started that thing on early childhood was all a buzz. And it was going to stay a buzz, and there was the new neuroscience that was driving that buzz. And I said, we better be at the forefront of that, because if you're talking that, you're talking the arts. And assessment. The world was going now bananas about assessment, and the national assessment was coming. So I said, okay, let's take these things on right away. Let's get right into the deepest stuff quickly. So I said, I rounded up a bunch of people, and we met and produced that document. Have you seen that one? Priorities for Arts Education Research. Those dates that I'll put there are when the document got published. It's not when the work began. And this was a very interesting thing in that I asked the College Board, the National Alliance of Business, the ASCD, the Association for Supervision, I asked them to lead this task force. And that became my strategy. Anytime we started a task force, I tried to find organizations who knew something about it, had high credibility, but they would come together. Maybe they had never actually been in the same room together. National Alliance of Business and AACD. And it was part of my notion that the only way to get this thing going was to release dynamic tension and not get the same old people in the same room, because you don't get anywhere. And that came out with 10 recommendations, a cluster in arts and learning and a cluster in public policy, and we have followed that. We have followed those things. And we did this little report. Have you ever seen that? Young Children in the Art Making Creative Connections. That was done with the National Association for the Education of Young Children, with Head Start, and with the Wolf Trap Center for Early Education in the Arts. They were the task force leaders. That document is still in use. There's a chart in it. When my daughter was having a baby, I gave it. There's a chart in there that tracks the developmental stages of the young child from the womb to 3rd grade, and the relationship between that and sensory stimuli, and the provision of sensory stimuli that emerges into formal arts activities as the child goes along, and the effect of that on the developmental processes of the child and on the relationship between the child and the caregiver. That was a big surprise to me. I hadn't expected that. It sort of never dawned on me that what the arts fundamentally do. It should have dawned on me, right? They build a relationship between the mother and the child, between the father and the child, between the caregiver and the child. The fundamental thing they do when you sing to the baby in the womb is they build a relationship. And that, developmental psychologists from the University of Minnesota kept pressing that. That became extremely important to me, to realize that I was interested in this and I had missed the point about, even though I'm interested in community, I'd missed the point. And that document lives. Well, then we did this. Arts Literacy for a Changing America. This was the release of the National Assessment. Anybody ever looked at that? Came out in 90, it was done in 97, came out in 99. Did you ever look at it? It's available in CD-ROMs. It's the only national assessment of the arts that was any good. There was only two of them. There were only two. There was one in 1972 and then this one. And what we did, I said, I was working with Dick Rowley, and I said, Dick, you need our help to interpret this assessment when it comes out, because it's going to be in statistical lingo, and you're not allowed to change the statistical lingo because you're the Department of Education. You have to, your statisticians have to tell you, but I can help you interpret it. And we did. And I put together another group task force with the music educators, among those involved in that, and 2 or 3 other groups. The College Board I brought back for that, the Education Testing Service, they had done the work. And we built another task force. How are we going to explain the results of this to people? And we did focus groups across the United States, and we found out if we linked it to literacy, but notice it's not arts and literacy, it's arts literacy. Arts literacy, because what that assessment was all about, in my view, it proved you could teach creativity. And I'll go into that if anybody's interested. And that was the argument that we made. And creativity, that is literacy and capacity in the arts, was fundamental to anything else you wanted a kid to do. And we ran teleconferences all over the country on that. And then we came to this, okay, Gaining the Arts Advantage, where we studied these school districts. And I assume some of you have seen that document. 13 factors that you have to have in place if you're going to have a school sustain the arts for all its kids in all its schools. You know, some school districts, we were just in Los Angeles, you have 750,000 kids in the LA public schools. We studied a school district in another that had 93 kids in the whole district. So if you're going to, there are factors you have to have in place. But the sine qua non that we realized when we discovered it was if the community around the district doesn't want the arts, you won't have it. Superintendents come and go. The demography of America, the kids come and go. You have to have in New York, in Boston, in Shaker Heights, Cleveland, you have to have a community outside the school that wants their kids to have the arts in school. Duh. And what does community mean? That was the other thing. There's no sense. To me, it was a kaleidoscope of centers of influence that could configure itself to have political clout. In some communities, it could be, in my community, I live in Baltimore, it's the black ministers. If you don't have the ministers of the black churches participating in your education agenda, you're not going to succeed. Not because they're against it. It's that they are voices for sections of the community that you're not going to reach. You're not going to reach in the schools in the way they need to be reached. It may be the business community. That's somewhat rare in my judgment. More often, it's communities understood as the real people, not in their institutional configurations in the first instance, but in the way they gather together, the real community. And if that's in a church, that's where they gather. If it's in a beer hall, that's where they gather. And what we set out to do then subsequently, and we're still trying to figure this out, how do you go into a school district and assist the school district in configuring these influential community segments that will then care about the arts? We're doing work with the Ford Foundation now in 11 cities on that. But my question was this. Isn't it your question? Why aren't the arts in schools? Why? And we then decided, and I had my inklings about it for my own work, but we decided to do focus groups around the United States with parents and others. And it came out this way, and a couple of years ago when I was here, I talked about it because this work was relatively new. Nobody believes it's about learning. They think you're gifted and talented, or you're somebody, some God struck you and you suddenly know how to sing. I mean, they don't get it, that the arts are things you can learn. And in learning them, it's a profound learning experience. People don't think that. Therefore, they don't think they're important in school. and they won't get you a good job. You'll starve to death. You won't get into the best colleges. I mean, you might if you've done the arts, but that may not count. You only got in because you did okay on the SATs and you were in 50 different groups and, you know, you did all the other stuff. And they won't get you out of the house. This is a big issue for parents in the United States. All parents want their children to leave home. It's the American thing. It's not the case in other countries, right? It's not the case in Peru necessarily. I know it's not in Brazil where I work. It's not. But in America, we believe you have to make it on your own. You have to be an individual. And if I don't know this, that you're developing the capacities to live on, I really worry about you as a parent. And I worry about those influences that I think are distracting you from that course of life. And I have a whole list of them. Don't do this, don't do that. And one of them is, God, don't get a career in the arts because you'll live at home. I'll never closing out the third floor. You'll always be there. And people have these fears. This is really true. They have these fears, and they arts. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later on, things are changing. We are succeeding. Okay. Well, we come out of this, I say, it's about learning. It's about learning. Where have I been? I've been trying to change institutions, policies, governments, and suddenly I'm missing the point. We have to talk about the arts as learning. That's where people are. That's what they don't get. They don't get it. And the research on that is not real good. There's a lot of research on how to teach the arts, but it's just beginning on, well, what happens to you when you paint? What happens to you when you dance? What happens to you when you do a piece of architecture? What happens? And this was this dropped on me like a gift from the sky. It had nothing to do with the beginning of this publication. The GE Fund, a woman named Jane Poland, who was head of funding there, brilliantly recruited a colleague from the MacArthur Foundation to fund several research studies, or if the research study was in progress, to give more money to the researcher under the general effort to find out, as the title of this really says, what's the impact of the arts on learning? There were 7 studies. Steve did the great one on Shakespeare and Company. That book was a revelation. Have you read it? I mean, that really was terrific. I got into it because I was angry at Jane because she had funded Growing Up Taller, and she funded Gaining the Arts Advantage. And I said, well, that's okay. You made up for it, sort of. But now you really got to keep funding, and so she did. So then now we're pals. And she said, okay, now you have to help edit and release this thing. You're going to publish it. I said, oh, great. So we get a lot of credit for this, the partnership, and I get some credit for it, but I don't deserve it. The document stands on its own, and we released it and we helped publish it. And frankly, what helped was, by this time, the Arts Education Partnership is getting to be pretty well known across the country as a place where you can actually trust it not to have a vested point of view. I'm not for visual arts, I'm not for museums, I'm not for school boards, I'm for them, all of them, as long as they're about kids. And as long as they're about the arts in the lives and the development of young people, then we're for it. But it's not, so we have developed a reputation of being for the arts in the lives of human beings, and particularly in the lives of young people. We've even moved to where I can now say we're about the arts just in schools, but wherever kids are. And that was a big leap for a lot of my organizational members who thought that, I don't want to talk about that community-based stuff. I'm worried about my job in schools. We're making progress. Now, this report began to show the power of the arts and learning, and it had that subtext. It can be even really good for challenged learners, however you want to describe the challenged learner. There's artificial descriptions. They're poor, they have special education, they're minority. They're challenged learners as individuals. And if within their group context more of them are in that group, doesn't mean everybody in that group. It's that terrible labeling we do where we say girls can't do such and so. You know, I mean, so what was more interesting was this was teasing out those challenged by any type of challenge they felt could be helped by the arts, because the real challenge that you face is the challenge you feel. I mean, it's not because you're a white male that you're challenged. You're only challenged if you think being a white male is a problem, and it is, of course. All right. Well, then we go to this, okay, and we produce critical links, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And I won't dwell on it because I've talked about that here before, and I assume you're. But it goes on to show multiple effects. And by the way, the title Critical Links came from interviews with parents. We would say to them, what do the arts mean to you? And they would say things like, well, I don't know, but I know for my kid they link to things. She really is happy. And so little by little, we realized people were saying, I don't know what art you're talking about. I don't even know whether I know what you're talking about. I just know what I mean by art. It links to what I want my kid, for my kid. So we called it critical links. And but underneath that was this question: why do the arts have these effects? What about them? And we began to answer it a little bit, but that's still the great question. Okay, I have my own things that I articulate about it. Among others, it's first of all, it's the most difficult thing and the most complete thing a human being can do. It's about cognition, affection, physicality, and it's making a piece of work. It's creating something. And to create it, it takes everything you've got. It takes your mind, your heart, your experiences. It takes the diligence of doing it. It takes the hand coordination. It takes the movement. It's a total package for the human being, and there's nothing else like it, not even sports. And therefore, it has infinite capacity for making you. And that's what you do. And the greatest work of art you make is yourself. And so all works of art are you're making yourself. And therefore, it has that enormous power because you care about it. And that's, all right, then here we are, almost up to date. We publish critical links. The two federal agencies say to me, well, all right, isn't it time then to do a new agenda? We did priorities 10 years earlier. And I said, okay. So I asked Steve and a bunch of other people, and the American Educational Research Association, you know who that is? That's all the educational researchers. That's their national group. When we released critical links, they publicly said, this is the benchmark for arts education research. There's never been anything as good, and from here you have to move forward from here. All right? Well, that was generous of them, and partly true. But it was certainly the first time things had been gathered in such a way that there was a potential platform. And so we said to them, you chair this. All right? You chair this new compendium. And they did. And so the American Educational Research Association chaired the task force, and we produced this document, which maybe you've seen, where we say, here are areas where future research is needed. Okay? Now, while that's going on, we're at work on another project that Steve referred to. I started this coming out of Champions of Change, and that was I was really interested in what we call high poverty schools. Schools where lots and lots of kids go who come from economically disadvantaged circumstances. We don't like to call them high poverty schools because the minute you say that, people think they know the kind of school you're talking about. They're not talking about Grizzly Hill Elementary School in the mountains of California, which has 93 kids, every one of them bright white. But people don't think that way. When you say high poverty, they automatically think you're talking about urban schools with high minority populations. Well, you may be. Also, they think that those schools, the school is economically disadvantaged. That's not necessarily the case. Because schools serving those populations often have subsidiary supplemental resources. So I don't like the term, but the main reason I don't like it is everybody thinks a high poverty school is a bad school, that it's failing. When in fact, there have been ample studies that a lot of schools with those populations do very well, and a lot of them do better than other schools. So what I wanted to find was high poverty, high high-performance schools who were using the arts as a dimension of their attempt to help the kids learn. And it took me about 2 years to get the funding to do this. And so then we launched a 3-year study, and that's what's been going on. Well, all this other stuff has been going on, and that's the work that we're about to publish as soon as I can write it. And now I'm going to close with this and a step, and I think that'll give us 20 minutes or so. Okay, that's where we came to from that. But remember, part of this, if I may say so, is because I grew up like this. Just the way we went about it. Teams going to these 10 case study schools and then casting the data, this is a qualitative study, casting it against known research, our own, but other kinds of study that were emerging, National Research Council studies and others. In the meantime, we threw off that little report. It's up on our website where we gathered and we were studying arts as community building with some Ford Foundation money. That became part of this study. If you haven't seen that little publication, that is really neat. We brought youth groups together and they ran a meeting for all of our members. The kids, they did it. And it was profound because it eliminated all the notion, I hate to use the word kids, it suddenly made people realize that people in schools called adolescents or kids, we have to get rid of that dichotomy. Most of them are smarter about themselves and their worlds than we are. And you have to let them help run them, or we'll fail. Guys like me, I mean, you just can't succeed if you don't let the people you're working with run the place. So here's what it is. Here's the title of the book. Third Space, When Learning Matters. What? That's what I wanted. I wanted people to say, what? What are you talking about? It doesn't even say anything about arts in the title. There's a long process of this. I had school administrators coming in periodically and so on and so forth. But here's in a nutshell what we're finding. It draws on the developmental psychology concept of mattering, which means exactly what the English word means, fortunately. You care. It matters to you. One of the great problems in school is that school doesn't matter to kids, to young people. It barely matters to teachers these days. And part of the reason is this great analysis that David Bloom did a couple of years. David Bloom comes out of English literature. He did the study that he labeled procedural learning. And that's the kind of kid I was in school. I was a very successful student in school because I could figure out how to get the teachers to give me good marks. I could figure out what they wanted, and I could talk to them. They wanted to be talked to, and I could pass the tests that they gave me, and I got good marks because I knew the procedures. I have forgotten 95% of whatever it didn't take. I just knew the processes, procedural knowledge. We're using the work of John Bransford. What Bransford says in his study of deep understanding is, if you don't link procedural knowledge to innovation and imagination, you don't really get the capacity to apply what you learn to other settings. It's called adaptive expertise. The only way to get adaptive expertise is to, in the common term, think out of the box and apply procedures to your new thought. I think that's a little like writing a piece of music. I think that's a lot like painting. I think that's a lot like writing a poem. You have to know the techniques, but the techniques are at service of what you want to imagine and make. And it's form and content. If you stay at the procedural technical level, you're a skeleton. You can get really, really good at that. It's called efficiency. You can get very efficient. A lot of companies run on efficiency. A lot of schools run on efficiency. They just keep doing the same thing over and over, and people get very good at doing it. But it might not be. Peter Drucker one time said, it's not doing things right, it's doing the right things. And what they forget is imagination, innovation, creativity is how you learn. And when you bring the two of them together, you become a great painter. You can't just imagine and not have any capacity to paint. You have to bring them together. So we use that, and what we're then doing is the other thing then is when what you're doing matters, then you really get a payoff. Then you really get engagement on the part of the students. Because you are saying, this matters. And I say to teachers, it's not, don't focus on the technical first. Don't, a little kid brings in a painting from home that she's done overnight. She's got a purple sky. I was in the classroom, I saw this happen. Teacher said to her, sky's on purple? I said, oh, geez. And when that happens, the kid suddenly it's about the kid. So you get this revelation. And what it produces is the kid suddenly realizes that somebody around here cares about me, it matters, and I'm really going to work hard. I'm really going to work hard. And they work harder and harder, and they get better and better. And the teachers, through this physical product, begin to see them differently. And the teachers say again and again, I never knew. And so then the teachers begin to treat one another better because they learn that I was boxed in to my own perspectives on the children. I'm boxed into my colleague down the hallway. And we begin to see in these schools what learning and community, the lingo is professional learning. We actually see teachers beginning to get along more because they realize through these progressive experiences that the child has been revealed to them, and they can teach the child better, and they feel more successful, and they like their colleagues better. And you begin to get a whole new set of learning conditions that in drama, theater, and in visual art is called third space. Third space is when two potentially diametrically opposed matter, you in a painting, me and you, come together, teacher and student, into some role assumption that creates a polarity where I think I'm a teacher and you're the student, and therefore there's something, that you're subservient and I'm in charge. Where you get third space, those differentiations are not the point. The point is we're in this together. And once you're in it together, and now here I want to get really precise. I want to come back to form and content. What the arts have the capacity to do is, and let's take drama. Because they have formal characteristics, you actually step formally into this new role. And it's not a great risk. It's a risk of being embarrassed. But for you to suddenly play a demented character, it's not a risk, because that's what you're supposed to do. And it begins to allow you in this third space to discover the new possibilities for you and new conditions. And when you step out of the space and reflect on it, and the teachers and you reflect on it, suddenly you can see the world very differently, and you see yourself differently. And the arts do that. It takes a certain kind of teaching, but that's what we're seeing in these schools. So we want to call it third space. And it's a set of new relationships and new learning conditions that the arts make possible. And when they make that possible, it changes the relationship, and it changes the way people act and live together in the school, and it can change the whole school. And some of the schools we're looking at are completely transformed. But if it doesn't transform the whole school, it changes those who are involved in the third space experiences. And that tends to be in high schools, because high schools are usually too big and too fractured. The structures of high schools are too imposing. They're too skeleton. And it's very, very hard to enliven them across the whole school. But you can create these conditions inside. And that's that. I didn't want to elaborate this because this is a book of probably going to be 150-some pages with student images. And what I want to tell you is the student images are not in there because they meet high expectation for aesthetic quality, the way the Scholastic Writing Contest might. They're in there because they are revelations. And my favorite is the little fifth grader. In a fifth grade class, we were in a South Carolina school, and the fifth grade class was asked to do a portrait of themselves 10 years from now. And this little kid, very poor background, the portrait of herself 10 years from now was a field of flowers. Okay, so here's what we're going to do next, based on all this. We got to get the word out, because what we're finding, and this is a new series of focus groups we're doing with the Ford Foundation, parents' attitudes are improving in our direction. They are improving in our direction. They used to say arts were good for our kids, but I don't care if they're in school or not. They are now angry. I mean parents at all socioeconomic levels. That's new. That's new. Parents are saying, this over-testing stuff, this reduction of the school experience, my kid's not happy. She doesn't even want to go. I mean, she's in second grade. She doesn't want to go. And there's a new set of attitudes that we can look to. And I think, by the way, our collective work has something to do with that, because it could possibly be the case, even under this new federal law and all the problems that it's creating, that people would still think, oh, testing is okay. But it's changing. And I think it's changing because I do believe that public attitudes are shifting toward a realization of the central importance of arts and culture in their lives. And by arts and culture, they may not mean whatever popped into your head when I said that. They have their own views of what that is. But they know those vital human experiences of making and responding are vital, and they're worried that they're disappearing. It's a very positive possibility. So we're working on some new communications processes with Ford about how do we tell our stories more. The second is I'm a little bit concerned. We're about to redesign high schools. You caught all that? I've been down that road a lot of times, and it's okay with me if you're going to redesign high schools, provided you have in mind that they're for the kids. Because rigor, you see all the lingo that's up? Rigor, high-stakes testing, improved college admission. Well, that's great. That's great. It's going to work for the 10% of the kids who are going to hang around to go through that. And dropout rates in urban areas can be 90%. Across the country, it's 30% for all populations. Right. I mean, 3 out of 10 kids don't finish. Half the African Americans don't finish. Half the Hispanics don't finish. I mean, and in urban areas, it's huge. I mean, it's not about the school. I mean, it's about kids. They're not coming. They don't want to be. Nothing matters to them. Doesn't matter to them. Their life outside matters more, and they'd rather go and try to make something happen in the life that matters to them than hang around a building that doesn't matter to them. And so we really have to focus on the adolescent and think through, as long as we're going to be on a No Child Left Behind for high school kids, we better start thinking about how to make that work out for all of the kids, not just for those that, like me, I would have ended up going, well, actually, I wasn't going to go to college until somebody told me I should, but I was able to do it. Teaching quality, worried about this. Again, it's moving in the same direction, as if certification in and of itself makes you a good teacher. And again, that runs the risk that artists teaching in the schools will not be as honored. So we have to argue for quality teaching, not, quality teachers. Quality teaching requires quality teachers, but quality teachers, the word quality can end up being a structural, not a lively. See what I mean? Form and content structure. And so we're devoting some energy to seeing what we can do to sort of say, you have got to have people teaching the arts that know how to teach the arts. They have to know the arts and be able to teach it. And you cannot leave artists out of that picture. And so that's on our agenda to push that. And then I really do want to see schools redesigned, but not just high schools. Middle schools are another problem area. Middle schools are, many of us were involved in the middle school movement 30 years ago. It was to invent a whole new kind of school that wasn't structure-bound by disciplines. It was about the kid, that crazy pre-puberty, early puberty period, which a woman on my staff back when I was Department of Education had 4 daughters who were all in that age range, and she wouldn't go home one night. She was the mother. And I said to her, Janet, come on, it's 7:30, 8 o'clock. You got to go home. She said, to that sea of hormones? Dealing with the middle school kid and I've said this before, we all know, or we think we know from the research, what happens to young girls when about 10 or 11, when their whole self-image is at risk. You know all of that. And I've argued, and for boys it goes somewhat, this is too facile, but that's when they drift toward the macho thing. It's a period where we have to have the school be a humane place, where we help them mediate their way through those dynamic changes, where the content of the learning is important, but the learner is what's really important, and helping the learner learn to learn during those middle years so that she then is in position to learn whatever she wants to learn later on. So there has to be rich and great content, but it has to be brought into bear with them in a way that, in fact, they continue to feel they can be in control of, and they can stay in control of their life. And that's what the arts does. So I'm now casting forward to where we came from, what we've done, and where we want to go. And I didn't leave time for questions, Steve. I'm sorry. But I meant to. Thanks. Well, for an encore, thank you very much. They're very gracious of you.
There is no other class in this space in the next few minutes, so Dick can stay for a couple minutes at least if people have thoughts or comments. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today and being with us, and thank you.
Yeah, and if you're free to stay, I'll hang around. I think 3 o'clock we go someplace else, but I'm happy to. And I know many of you have other time constraints and pressures. Why don't we, those that really must leave or must leave for any reason, like I got to get out of here, feel free, and then we'll take some questions.
A couple minutes because there's a lot of people have classes.
Okay.
I do have to leave, but I have to tell you that I was so inspired by your speech. And everything that I've read has really had a huge impact on me.
Terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Work at MoMA, so I'm catching my bus to go down to New York. I just wanted to just say that was excellent, and I was so excited about a lot of what you said, so it was a pleasure to meet with you today.
Well, you provided lunch, so.
Yeah. Anytime, it's Steve.
Great. But thanks, Mark. Yeah, see you. Anybody want to ask anything or comment or say, well, that was just ridiculous? Yeah.
You said you might be able to comment more about the young children in the arts
Yeah.
and the teaching of creativity.
Young children in the arts is just to say a word about that. As I said, our first effort there was prompted by the neuroscience and the realization that the child in the womb is learning, and the implications of that for then the child to the age of 3. And at that point, we're talking 6, 7 years ago, there was the notion, remember, that by the age of 3 years, lots of important things had happened, and maybe the kid was stuck with them. And that turns out, fortunately, not to be the case, but it really made us nervous, as it should, that all the preschool development of the child, if it's not good, the kid entering the school is already way behind. And so we plunged into this because it was our view that, as one of our people said, and I think you say it in the book, play is the natural learning experience for a young kid. And play involves dealing with the physical world in movement and sensory reaction. And the more you learn, the better you learn to play, really, the better you can play, the better you're learning. And so we explored that in some depth and published this report that teases that out. And then we looked at programs around the country that were doing it well. So that report looks at the spectrum of child development and corresponds then to stimuli. And I know parents use it a lot. We wanted to get it out through pediatricians. And we're still trying to do that because it has a chart you can hang on your wall. And I know my daughter, who had a child, and now my daughter-in-law, use it. And, you know, they've used it in my granddaughter's 7. And throughout the first years of her life, they've used it. And it's really quite significantly helpful. And the little kid, the new grandson, is 6 months old, and his mother's a fanatic about it. It almost wears me out to go in there. And things are twirling around, and she's singing. So that's an important piece. On the national assessment, assessed with actual arts experiences. It wasn't just paper and pencil. It was, and they assessed in capacity to respond, performance, and creating original work. And and the results were not great, by the way, because one of the problems was it was done in 8th grade, and only half the kids in the country have arts. And by the time they get to the 8th grade, even less have arts. So you got a problem there. But what it showed was there was a link between responding and creating. The kids that knew more about, and I'll give you the example of Romare Bearden. There was a great collage, Romare Bearden, memory of my childhood in Pittsburgh, by the way. And there were a series of exercises the kids had to go through. So they're responding to, formal qualities of it through paper and pencil constructed response. Then make one. Make a collage of a member of your own childhood, and the kids had to make them. Then they had to write an essay about what they made. And it was an extraordinary thing. And just to summarize and to go forward, the more they were able to perceive the work, the more well realized their own collage was. And that worked across it. And my view of that was we were seeing that you can teach creativity by teaching the arts and teaching the techniques of the arts, but also encouraging the child to make the arts their own. And so we brought out a lot of stuff about that. In fact, I think had a significant effect on the way that the materials were then interpreted. So that's what I meant with those little throwaway lines in there. And then we'll come down. How about if we go that way? 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit on the plans that you have for teacher development, teacher training in terms of making better teachers.
We put out. Let me make a point here that the staff of the Arts Education Partnership is 4 people. For the first 6 years, it was 2. And so what I'm going to respond to you is what we have done is to work with all of our organizations. If you might, we envision the work. We do our best to lead and challenge. Right? And so a number of years ago, I had a task force on teacher. Well, we called it the Arts Teaching Workforce because we wanted to deal with artists, certified teachers, classroom teachers, those that the kid bumps into in formal settings who teach them the arts. Museums, if they're over in a museum. So who's the workforce? How do we guarantee that? How do we try and help that workforce teach better? And we had a task force of 60 organizations. And we brought out what that led to was we realized that you can't change higher education just by talking about it, where the undergraduate occurs. And you can't get universities engaged with cultural organizations and schools easily because there's nothing in it for the faculty. there's no incentive. You don't get tenure that way. So we began to look at places where, in fact, inside a university there was a form of collaboration between the College of Fine Arts and the College of Education, a rarity, by the way, and where there was a relationship with the K-12 public school market and with arts and culture, where there was a triangulation of partnering. And we found about 30 pretty good ones, and we brought them together and started saying, well, okay, tell us how this is working. How'd you do that? Just like we did Gaining the Arts Advantage. My work is inductive. I personally believe that good things are going on everywhere. We have to find where they are and then say, how's this happening? Not generate theoretical and sort of, it'll be great if everybody passes a test. And so we convened them, we published a report called Teaching Partnerships, and that's on our website. And it's it's about 30 pages. And it lays out a series of recommendations about how we should move forward. And we've been pushing that since through the cooperating organizations. It's led to a very significant improvement in the training of artists to be teachers. There's a tremendous movement in the country in orchestras and museums and performing arts to help, and it's a bit growing in colleges and universities in the fine arts department, like the conservatory. The New England Conservatory is part of a national group, where there's a realization that if you're going to be an artist, you're probably going to teach, and it may actually be the only secure job you're going to end up with for a while if you want to keep doing your art form. And so there's been a wonderful maturation of the processes for preparing the great painter to teach. And that work is going forward. That's good stuff. And we're now trying to push even further to see what can we do in higher education. How can we show higher education the value to them of doing a better job in training the undergrad, particularly the classroom teacher who goes in, she's got 8 sets of standards she's supposed to be teaching in the 3rd grade, and one of them is supposed to be 4 art forms. And the best she ever did was somebody showed her, how to make slides in a class in a college. And so we're trying to figure out how we can make some movement where the arts become as integrated into the undergraduate education stream for everybody in it, and not just a course you get so you can fulfill that course requirement. And that's a big problem. But we're pushing on it. We now have a group of provosts and deans that are trying to identify within their own institutions how this might be working. And when we get to a point where we think we've found some things, we'll publish that. But that is an enormous mountain. It's an enormous mountain. Actually, it's not an enormous mountain. It's about 5,000 mountains, because every institution of higher education is different. And they're practically sui generis. There's almost nothing generic you can easily do across them. Harvard is not Towson State, which graduates the largest number of teachers in the state of Maryland, where I live. Was that responsive? Yeah. Okay. And then, yeah, Roger.
I'm afraid to ask this, but it won't be great if you ask it, because I thought I heard you say, almost when you regret for passing, that the instrumental aspect of art baloney, and I've lost it.
I don't see. I think that that's a phony distinction between. Let me put it this way: artistic objects have an intrinsic. The painting on the wall has certain intrinsic features to it. Of course, the color. Those are so. The ingredients of the artifact have an intrinsic, but the experience of making and responding to it is a total package. And the thing that happens when you're responding to a painter, that experience is intrinsic. I mean, it's your experience. If you then decide that you're going to paint, or that you're going to take your notes in class with graphic images, I don't see where that's an instrumental. I mean, that's just you using your embrace of the arts in your way of doing things. And if, in fact, with good teaching in good classrooms, the things you've learned to do in drama lead you to be more tolerant when you're in a classroom with people who don't look like you. I don't see where that's an instrumental. I think it's you who's learned that through your arts experience, and you're just applying it in a different kind of setting. I'm not making an argument that the arts, therefore, are instrumental. I'm making an argument that you are. And that see, the problem is that people think that I'm having this fight with the RAND Corporation over it. They think that in critical links we argued for instrumental. There's no argument in critical links for instrumentality. It's a description of what happens to you. You learn to think better. You are more persistent. You're more engaged in learning. When that happens to you, you have a capacity, as Branford says, to apply that in other settings. You have to decide to do it. Or a teacher has to facilitate that through intentionality, as we all have always known. So, I really feel that buying into that, you must only argue for music because it's a cultural value and it's fundamentally important. And the minute you say it helps children learn other subjects, you're arguing instrumentality. I say baloney. I believe, as I said there, I believe that the objects have their own value as artifacts, as cultural phenomenon, and are perfectly studyable as pyramids. But the learning activity of the child, it doesn't mean that that's instrumental. I mean, those terms just don't, they seem to me, Richard Rorty, who's the great philosopher that I studied with and who then, like me, gave it up to move into pragmatism, said one time, he said, the only way to change a culture is to change the way it talks. And that to me, and some of you, any of you heard a couple of years ago, I was talking about we need a new lexicon for talking about the experience of the arts. And part of that was an attempt on my part to get out of talking this intrinsic instrumental. Give it up, folks. Give it up. And let's start talking about the holistic experience of involvement in the arts that changes the human being. That's adaptive expertise, by the way. That's true transfer. I also don't buy into transfer. This to this, this to this. I think that's a waste of time. That can be done in medical models, but so at any rate. And now, also, for instance, people say that if you talk about the arts as a museum assisting the economic development of a city, that's an instrumental use of the museum. And I'm saying, wait a minute. What are you talking about? It's an instrumental museum. The museum is there. It has its own purposes. And being there, it's like Wallace Stevens with his jaw up on the hill. The world gathers around it. And it makes a new economy of ideas and therefore of financial possibilities. It's not instrumental to the museum that suddenly the city around it gets better. It's there, and it happens. And you justify the museum in all those terms. And so I just, that's more than you might have, but I just see no benefit. I see no benefit in getting into that intrinsic, unless you're talking about the object. And one of the critiques that is one of the critiques in aesthetics is this thing well made? Well, that's an intrinsic question. My problem is if you go too far down that road of is it well made, by the way, and if you're a teacher of little kids, you're not helping the little kid. You want to know, first of all, what's the kid trying to say here? As you want with any art form. I was reading, I was in the museum in the Sackler. No, what's the German, Busch-Rascher. And I happened to, I kind of intrigued by the work of Joseph Beuys and you know, the early work, the multiples. And there happens to be a huge, that research room upstairs is fantastic if you haven't been in it. Anyway, there's a huge book of Beuys' multiples. And there's a long interview with them in the front of it. And I was really quite intriguing. And I'll tell you, they said, why did you always make gray, you know, the gray coats, the boys' gray coats? He said, well, why did you ask that? They said, well, you always use a gray. He said, well, that has nothing to do with your response to it. He said, did you ask yourself, what is my response to this gray jacket? And he said, that's third space. because he said, I made them gray so that all the colors would be in your head. He said, I wanted you to provide the colors. And that to me is that sort of, the reality is the interface. The aesthetic object then could be analyzed, and this guy was denigrating it because it was gray. And he was saying, you know, it couldn't be aesthetically powerful, this gray drab felt coat. And Boy's response was, the aesthetic experience is your experience of it. I'm trying to create an aesthetic experience. You can't judge my work without bringing your own experience into it. So Boyce goes further than I would go. I mean, I would say you could tell if that's a good piece of music or not. But he would say, well, maybe he wrote it that way. Cage did it that way to shock the hell out of you and to create an experience. And so, and that's what Peter DeBola argues in Art Matters, the little book I was telling. He argues that that aesthetics is your response, and that aesthetic criteria have to be set aside. You have to interrogate yourself first. You know, why do I think that Barnett Newman didn't know how to paint? Because he could only do that one thing. He only wanted to do that one thing. So, I mean, so I just feel that getting into those intrinsic just is so just doesn't, it just ties you up a notch. You don't get to the real stuff. You had your hand up first.
I am so moved by your presentation, and I have a lot of questions for you. But I guess I'll focus on one, which is a comment you made about why the arts matter, and your comment that the arts provide infinite capacity for making you. That
Yeah.
ultimately comes back to you, and that the greatest work of art is itself.
Yeah.
Which speaks so much to me. I love it, and I feel moved by it, and I feel like that attitude informs a lot of the work I do in schools. But I'm curious about your international experience and your international work, and the ways in which educators globally advocate for the arts, where the self is not as valued or as focused or as central to identity and experience. I just feel like I am steeped in Western culture and philosophy and tradition, as it seems you are as well, and we all are here too. And I just keep debating this concept, the role of autobiography in art making, and whether it's a luxury or whether it's something that's universally valued.
Oh, well, I think the narrative oneself is inescapable. That is, I don't care what culture. I did work in Japan. I had to study Japanese schools at one point. Just to take that up for just a moment. It seems to me that any human being tells a narrative to herself about who she is. And the arts help you form that narrative. Now, the narrative in our culture tends to be a narrative in which your goal of the narrative is to distinguish yourself as an individual. That's what this country and certain Western societies are about. In other cultures, the narrative you want to tell is how you integrate yourself with your colleague, with your community, but it's still about you. And it's not as if the image of Japanese painting, which is you have to train yourself to imitate, an imitative response. There's nothing about that seems to me to say that that's not about you. It's that what the narrative is you want to tell to yourself is how you have become an important part of a community, and we could call it a traditional way of entering into it, but it's your way, and it's the way in that culture. Here, in fact, you have to create a way to look different, to be different, to establish yourself differently. It seems to me it's the same human activity, but the cultural context, the nature of your narrative of who you want to be, is within that context. Now, as you probably know now, one of the things that was always been concerned is women within Japan. And you've probably read now with the influence of other companies locating in Japan and more foreigners in Japan than ever, there's now a potential new narrative that Japanese women can tell themselves about who they can and should be. And it's creating some tensions within the culture at large. But it's what's going to happen. And that possibility then allows them to begin to tell a new narrative of individuation. And it's going to create tremendous psychological problems until that's sorted out, because it's just very much not the narrative. The previous narrative was not an imprisoning one in and of itself. It was the way the narrative was lived out by the guys who positioned themselves as the ones who were in charge of the narrative. And therefore they were the ones that, within that very communal tradition bound, introduced the notion that we were the ones that were in charge of it. But that's sort of everywhere. And so I don't... and internationally, by the way, just quickly, and I guess I better stop because we've got to be somewhere quick. The arts are not in great shape in lots of places. In the industrial nations, you might think that in France, someplace, there's much better art being taught in schools. I didn't see it. It's a more homogeneous culture, or it was. But so I think some of the issues we're grappling with in arts education here are unique to us. But unfortunately, the rest of the world isn't great. But the main problem I found in international education is Americans don't believe they can learn anything from any other country. It's really a cultural arrogance. It's incredible. We actually think we're good at everything. I guess that's why we don't take up soccer, because we know we're going to lose there.
Except for the women.
Except for the women. Well, there you go.
Thank you again.
Thank you.